Thank you for coming, and it's very nice to see you all. My name's obviously Jo Burmester. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and my background, and then we're going to talk about the future of clinical research. So my background is I worked in the pharmaceutical industry in clinical trials for about 5 years, and then I moved into a full-time training role. So I've been a clinical research trainer for a very long time now, and I'm not prepared to say how long these days. So talking about the future of clinical research, there are a lot of factors that are going to influence how clinical research works in the future. I'm going to focus this afternoon on the regulatory changes that are coming through. But there are a lot of other factors that are going to influence how clinical research works, not least the types of products that are being developed, because we've got a lot of new innovative types of therapies and healthcare kind of interventions, I guess, if you'd like to call it that, that are being developed, and actually working out what a particular product is can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. So that's the first step, is to know what kind of a product it is that you're developing, and then you will know what kind of rules you need to follow. But also there's a lot of talk about the different types of design of research now as well, and looking at umbrella trials and basket trials and platform trials and all that kind of stuff. That's a very hot topic as well. I'm not going to go into that today. I'm going to focus on the regulatory part. So first of all, thinking about what we are talking about this afternoon, the first question to ask is what do I mean by clinical research? And there are lots of different types of research going on within the NHS, and within academia, and also within medical charities, and also within the industry as well. So we've got CTIMPs, which are clinical trials of investigational medicinal products. So those are the traditional pharmaceutical sponsored, historically, clinical research projects using medicinal products. A lot of these are now being run non-commercially as well. And the important thing to remember is that the rules for how to run these trials are identical whether you're a commercial or a non-commercial organisation. It's just the practical outworking, the practical implementation of the rules that is different if you're a non-commercial as opposed to a commercial organisation. Then there's also a lot of research being done with medical devices, and we were just talking in the break earlier that this is quite a hot topic, and it's something that is expanding rapidly. And the regulation around medical devices is being tightened up quite a lot, so we're going to talk about that briefly as well. There are obviously other types of research that are being done within the NHS and within academia, but I'm not going to talk about those today. I'm going to focus on medicinal products and medical devices. And the regulatory landscape is changing quite dramatically in both of these areas. So we'll talk first of all about CTIMPs, so medicinal products, clinical trials of medicinal products. We have ICH-GCP, which has recently been updated, and that's the kind of gold standard for ethical conduct of clinical research with medicinal products, and it's recently been updated. We've also got massive changes to the EU regulatory framework around development of medicines, and we've also had the GDPR regulation come in recently, and that's had an impact to some degree on clinical research as well. And one of the questions I'm often getting asked is about the B word, Brexit, and what does it mean for the future of clinical research. And in the short term, it means not very much, to be honest. And the MHRA have kind of two scenarios in place: there's deal or no deal. And either way, we're going to be following the same rules as the EU for the next 2 years at least. So Brexit's not actually going to make that much of a difference in terms of the practical requirements for running clinical trials. Where it will make a difference is whether we can be part of the EU's regulatory approval system, which is a much bigger question, and we don't know the answer. So what are the changes? Well, first of all, is ICH-GCP. ICH is an international council which looks at drug development globally and puts in place guidelines to streamline the process. And they've produced a lot of documents, but one of the key ones that we work to when we're running clinical trials is GCP. So it's ICH E6 is called ICH GCP, so good clinical practice, which really is good clinical research practice. And the latest version was finalised in November 2016. Um, it was implemented to deal with increased globalisation of research and also the complexity of clinical trials. Um, there was some statistics I saw recently. The number of endpoints in your average clinical trials increased by 86% over the last few years. So clinical trials are much more complex than they used to be, and often are run globally rather than just in one country. So the new version adds new guidance and new information to the requirements for clinical trials. And the key changes are in the areas of electronic records, because the original version of this guidance came out in 1996. And at that point, everybody was still pretty much using paper, whereas obviously now we tend to use electronic records for most things now, and management of that and data quality and data integrity is a different ballgame, a different kettle of fish when you've got electronic records rather than paper. There's also a huge amount in ICH GCP now about risk management and risk-based approaches to management, and particularly the monitoring process that the sponsor undertakes when they're running a clinical trial. There is now a requirement to do a risk assessment for every clinical trial, and then to have a management plan based on that risk assessment. So that's been quite a big change, and the industry particularly are very nervous about that. The NHS has been using risk-based management of clinical trials for a long time because they just don't have the resources to do the level of oversight that the industry do. So the industry are now having to catch up with that. But the main focus, and one of the reasons that I do what I do, is about subject protection. And by subjects I mean the people who are taking part in the research. So a lot of that is patients who are ill. And it's about protecting them and making sure that when we do research on human subjects, we're actually looking after them properly and we're protecting their rights, their safety and their well-being. And then a close second to that comes the quality of the data. And the new version of this guidance really emphasises those two things, subject protection and data quality. And then we have the new European legislation. This is where you find all the European legislation to do with medicinal products in the EU, is EUDRELEX. And EUDRELEX Volume 10 is the part of it that deals with clinical trials. So we have all these different areas within the legislation and guidance. So Chapter 1, which I've represented by a tick box, that's approvals. So in order to conduct a clinical trial, you need a clinical trials authorisation from the government, and you need ethics committee approval from an ethics committee. Chapter 2 I've represented by skull and crossbones. Would anybody like to hazard a guess as to what that might be about? It's about safety. So it's about toxicity basically. So reporting potential side effects is all covered in Chapter 2. And then Chapter 3 is all about management of the product itself. So that's medication is included there. Chapter 4 is about inspections. So this is when MHRA come out to inspect the clinical trial. Those are the guidelines that they work to. And then Chapter 5 is additional information, so all kinds of other stuff. And then Chapter 6 is the legislation. So the new version of the regulation was published in 2014 actually, but the latest estimate for implementation is 2020. So the rules are going to change quite dramatically in 2020, and they will be the same across the EU. At the moment there's a lot of variation in the different countries, but it will be the same right across the EU when this new regulation comes in. And MHRA have said that what they will do is, if there's a deal, we will follow this for the first 2 years. If there is no deal, they will basically cut and paste this regulation into the UK legislation for the first 2 years. So we'll be following the same information regardless, for 2 years at least. The key changes with this regulation, the biggest change is the authorisation procedure for clinical trials. And there's going to be a centralised procedure where every country has comments at the same time, and then there's a centralised review and approval process for the clinical trials. There's also a lot in there about transparency. There's been a lot of stuff, I don't know whether you've heard of the All Trials campaign, initiated by Ben Goldacre after he wrote his book. about bad pharma. So getting all clinical trial sponsors, and that's non-commercial as well as commercial sponsors, to publish their clinical trial results, and that is going to be mandatory under the new regulations. There are some new definitions of what is a clinical trial and what is a clinical study, so I'll just go through that first of all. So the first definition is a clinical study, and a clinical study is any research project where the object of the research is a medicinal product. Okay, so they could be interventional or non-interventional, so they might just be observational research studies. And then within that, you have a subsection which is a clinical trial. So a clinical trial is an interventional clinical study, and there are various criteria that apply to make something interventional, but basically it's if you've got allocated treatment, randomised treatment, or you've got unlicensed medication, that makes it a clinical trial rather than just a clinical study. And then within that, you've got another subsection of low interventional clinical trials, and a lot of non-commercial clinical trials would be low interventional. So these are trials that are run with marketed product, and the interventions within the protocol are very low risk, and that makes them low interventional. So the bits that are subject to the regulation are all of the clinical trials, whether they're interventional or not. But if it's a clinical study and not a clinical trial, then it's not part of the regulation. So that would be subject to other rules like research governance within the NHS. And then I just wanted to go on and talk about medical devices regulations as well, because that is all changing too. There's a new set of legislation coming out to do with medical devices. So currently we have the Medical Devices Directive, and then these other ones that deal with specific types of device. In the future, we're going to have a medical devices regulation which will replace these two, and then an in vitro diagnostics regulation which will replace that one. So they've already been finalised, and the implementation timelines, they are already in force, but they don't apply yet. So it's similar to the clinical trials regulation. They've been published and they're officially in force, but both pieces of legislation are waiting for a database to be designed and developed, which has taken a very long time. So the clinical trials regulation has already been delayed by 4 years. It was supposed to come in 2016, and they're now saying 2020. So I have a feeling that these ones might end up getting delayed as well, because again, they're looking at a central database. So it's going to be at least 2020 though. So the changes coming in with the medical devices regulation, you probably all remember there was a scandal a few years ago about breast implants where they were using the wrong kind of silicone, and a lot of the changes have been driven by those kinds of incidents. So there's been a general tightening of the requirements for regulation of medical devices, and making sure that they are properly tested and assessed before they're placed onto the market, and also that manufacturers are inspected more regularly. So clinical investigation, which is a clinical research project with a medical device, they are more likely to be needed. So at the moment, some medical devices get onto the market without ever having a clinical investigation. If the manufacturer could show evidence from other sources that it was okay, then they could still get a CE mark to put it on the market. But it's more likely now that new devices will need to have some form of a clinical investigation in order to prove that it works and it's safe. As I said, there's going to be this central database which will allow for this central review of the clinical investigation applications. And generally, in terms of the clinical investigations part, there's more emphasis on subject protection again. So it's about ethics committee review, it's about the informed consent process for taking part in a clinical investigation, and also there's a tightening up of the reporting of adverse device effects, so we know where things have gone wrong with devices. So it's all been kind of tightened up and made more controlled. There is also this document ISO 14155, which is an international standard, and that's the standard for ethical conduct of clinical investigations. And again, that's being updated. That will come in hopefully in 2020 as well. These are the things that are being added. And a lot of these are very similar to the changes in ICH GCP for the clinical trials with investigation medicinal product. So there is a kind of a coming together of the two sets of regulation, because historically they've been very, very different, but they are kind of moving more together, so that they will be more similar in the future than they are currently. So in summary, more changes happened, more changes coming, and there is a lot of guidance out there. I obviously, my role is to provide training on all of these things, so if you need more information, please do give me a shout. Obviously my website is up there, so you can contact me through that. But if anybody's got any questions, if we have time, if anyone's got any questions now, I'm happy to take them.